Warm welcome to all of you on another of our many wonderful Tuesday talks. It's now 7:31, so this is time to say hello. And it's good to see so many people, and it's particularly good to see Anthony Peake. Some 15 years ago, I found myself reading two books about life after death, which struck me very strongly. One was by the late David Fontana, who was a friend of mine, and very good it was too, and the other was by Anthony Peake. And until this moment, I haven't managed to catch up with him. His book then was called Is There Life After Death? And it deploys arguments very encouragingly, very similar arguments to David Fontana's work, with interesting differences as well, though. And Anthony's written a lot of books, which you can find quite easily on his website and on Amazon, about a wide variety of topics of interest to all of us. But I suppose, in order not to take up any of his time, what I want to do is suggest that he's going to chat away now for 45 minutes, and then we'll switch to a Q&A, and I'll do my usual thing with the chat if you'd like to put questions in there. But the link here is that his next book, which is called Cheating the Ferryman, and of course, although he comes from the Wirral, he doesn't mean the ferry across the Mersey. He means the ferryman who takes you across the Styx and the other rivers of the underworld when you die, I presume. But the reason I haven't read Cheating the Ferryman is that it hasn't come out yet, and it is anyway his new book. So from much earlier, but also from Is There Life After Death to Cheating the Ferryman, you can see what Anthony's perhaps main interest is. It is essentially in the spiritual world and what it means for our futures individually. And so without more ado, I'm going to say, Anthony, over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction. So thank you very much. What I'm going to be doing is I'll be presenting information on my previous book, which is called the Hidden Universe. And the reason I was interested in the Hidden Universe was the idea. Well, no, what I will do is I'll do the presentation. So my writing has always been developmental. I'm not coming from any position at all. In fact, my position is always open-minded and trying to understand exactly what the human condition is and what it is to be alive and everything else. So my writings are very, very broad sweep. But at the same token, if I come across information from science, from quantum physics, from neurology, neurochemistry, that contradicts the things I say, I'm quite happy to change my opinion. So I'm not doctrinaire in any shape or form. But I believe my model has a degree of validity to it because it has historical validity, because it references things that go right back to the earliest philosophers. But at the same token, I really play with leading edge science as best I can. I mean, I'm in regular contact with some of the world's leading quantum physicists, astrophysicists, and neurologists, including a group of friends of mine that are doing astonishing research at the moment at Imperial College into the effects of dimethyltryptamine in terms of consciousness and entities. And this is going to be something I'll be touching upon now. So what I need to do is now share my screen if I can. So I'm going to do this now, and we can hopefully make a start. So what I need to do is now, can everybody see that okay? Is that clear? Good, thank you, Peter. So let's go on to the presentation, and hopefully it will open up properly. There you go. Okay, so that's my ugly mug, which you don't particularly want to be seeing a great deal of, but okay, so why did that not move to the next one? That's curious. I don't know why it's doing that already, the archons, but we'll go through it this way if we can. Okay. A few years ago, I received a very, very curious phone call from my mother. Now, my mother was in her early 90s at the time, and she was walking home with my aunt to the village that I was brought up on, the Wirral, called Bromber Pool. And her message was quite curious because she said, something very, very strange happened last night. I was walking onto the village with your aunt. They were both widows and everything, so they become friendly in their old age. And she said, we saw something very, very curious. She said, your aunt had stopped to tie her shoelace. And as she'd done so, I looked over her head and I looked towards the old site of an old factory called Price's. And she said, I saw above the factory a swirling disc of cloud. And she described it as almost being a dark cloud. And it was going round in circles. And then she said, suddenly it went down to a small point and then shot off towards North Wales. Okay. Now, the thing that was interesting about this was that somebody subsequently contacted me to say they saw that object. So there was corroboration from somebody else who had seen that object. So whatever my mother saw, it was there out in three-dimensional space. Now, she then says to me, what did I see? And I said, Mum, I really don't know. It could have been anything. Now, it's very important to realise at that stage, my mother had lost one eye with malignant melanoma, and her other eye was developing cataract, so she was partially sighted. This is quite important. So then she phones me up again 2 weeks later in a state of hysterics one morning. And she said, I woke up in the middle of the night last night, and I looked towards the door, and I live on my own, and I always close my bedroom door, and my bedroom door was open. And she said, not only that, but I couldn't move. Now, I immediately realised she was in a state of sleep paralysis. It's a well-known phenomenon. It's to stop with the body, when you wake up and you're in a hypnagogic state in the middle of the night, hypnopompic, your body protects you from damaging yourself, from moving around and enacting your dreams by physically moving your body. So it stops you damaging your body. But when you sometimes come conscious in these circumstances, you cannot move. Okay. But when you're in this state, it's a liminal state between waking consciousness and hypnagogia or hypnopompia, which is that kind of liminal state, where I argue what I would say is the doors of perception are slightly more open, where you can access information, an information field, a visual field, and a sensory field, which is broader than the normal waking consciousness. She said she looked towards the door, and as she looked towards the door, she saw what she described as a small being with huge black eyes, 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. It looked round the door and it blinked at her and dodged back. It realised it shouldn't have been seen and realised it. It reacted to my mother. She then was terrified and she eventually managed to go to sleep. And she wakes up in the morning, she phones me up and she asks and says, Tony, what did I see? And I said, Mum, I'm really not sure. Now, my mother is not somebody that was interested in extraordinary phenomena at all. It's just something that didn't interest her at all. I mean, she was very much a very good historian and everything else, but she was not interested in the kind of nonsense I was interested in, she used to call it. So I didn't worry her. But to me, I was intrigued because clearly what the creature she had seen is a classic grey, an absolute classic trope of what we have in terms of alien encounters. Now, the image that she was describing comes particularly from a book cover from a book called Communion that was written by an American writer called Whitley Strieber. Now, I've interviewed Whitley on quite a few occasions about his experiences, and if we get onto that, we'll come back to this, and I've been on Whitley's show a couple of times. But I found this very intriguing, so I started to ask her more questions about her circumstances, and one day I'm talking to her and she goes, the little children, they've stopped singing to me. And I looked and I said, what do you mean? And she said, the children, they have very high-pitched voices. They're not really children, they're just small creatures that are always around me when I'm shopping, when I'm walking. And they look at me and they chatter between each other. And they have very high-pitched voices. And I said, right. And she said, but they're not that friendly. And they're not as friendly as the old man in the bathroom, in the kitchen. And I said, right. She said, yeah, there's an elderly gentleman I see regularly in my kitchen. And he nods at me and he smiles at me and he's very friendly. Now, I realised very quickly what was happening here. I knew from my own research there is something called Charles Bonnet syndrome. And Charles Bonnet syndrome is something that affects people who are partially sighted. It's supposedly the body's, the brain's accommodating of the fact that somebody can't see things properly. So it starts to confabulate imagery in external reality. It was first put together by, ironically enough, a guy called Charles Bonnet, who was a Swiss doctor way back in the late 18th century, and he noticed that his uncle, a guy called Lullin, was seeing things. And he started to research this, and it is now a known phenomenon. Now, I got my mother the diagnosis of this because it's also a precursor of something called Alzheimer's disease. Now, this intrigued me because I was thinking, what is happening here with my mother? Why is she seeing these things suddenly? So, because I've been researching a lot of these subjects over decades now, nearly 50 years, so there were a lot of bits I could join together here. Now, this is a symbol of sleep paralysis, because when people have sleep paralysis, it usually affects children and sometimes young adults. And again, as I explained, it's the feeling that you're paralyzed. But when you do this, there are entities in the room. People see things. They see something called the hag, which is usually a person in profile with a cowled figure that will be sitting in the corner. Or there's an entity sitting on the bed. Many of you may have known the famous painting by the Swiss British painter Fuseli, which is called The Nightmare. And if you look at it, you have a lady lying in bed and there's an entity sitting on her chest, because there's pressure on the chest when people have this experience. Okay, so, but there's more to this experience than meets the eye, because children report Charles Bonnet syndrome quite regularly, but it's not diagnosed as Charles Bonnet syndrome. And in my book, I say this is a wrong diagnosis. Charles Bonnet syndrome can affect young children and can affect elderly people as well. And I argue this is because the neurological correlates of the brain are repeating each other. I argue that as you get older, you regress back to being a child. It's something called neonatalism. There was a guy called Barry Riceberg who first came up with the idea that as we get older and we go into Alzheimer's, we start to mirror the development of the fetus. And in fact, I tested this with my mother, because my mother then came down with Alzheimer's, and she went into a state of complete comatoseness. She didn't communicate. And she then started to move like a fetus. She actually started to curl over like a baby in the womb. And one of the things I was aware of was something called a Babinski reflex, which is if you stroke a newly born baby's foot underneath, and I can never remember whether the toes curl inwards or outwards, but when you do it and they curl in a particular direction, the Babinski reflex is there. Now, as the child grows older, they lose the Babinski reflex. It disappears. It's also in children in the womb. But I've discovered that elderly people in the final stages of Alzheimer's also have Babinski reflex, as if they are becoming a baby again, or a fetus. And I tested this with my mother. And indeed, I got the Babinski reaction in exactly the same way I expected it to be, okay, which is intriguing. But this is another area we can discuss later. But suffice to say, young children see little people. Now, again, there was a guy called Michael Halliwell who wrote a book a few years ago called Invisikids. And in the book, Halliwell argues that young children see these entities all the time. But what he doesn't do is the neurology and the physiology of it, which I do. And I argue it is to do with the way in which the neurons of the brain of young children are not myelinated. So they're not insulated. So the neurons of the brain are open to much more influence than ordinarily when we're locked in within our normal neurons. Also, the corpus callosum, which is the thick-bodied body that holds the two hemispheres of the brain together, also isn't fully developed. And many of you will know of the work of people like Julian Jaynes and his bicameral mind theory. This is very much what I apply to this. So the idea is that young children, their brains aren't fully developed. And then when you get to the end of life, the amyloid plaques, which are the things that destroy the neurons within the brain when somebody has Alzheimer's disease, is doing the same thing. It's destroying the brain's ability to be an attenuator, its ability to block out the wider information field. Now, these are a couple of pictures that children have drawn of entities that they see. Now, look at this. These are consistent with what my mother saw. So, you know, this is an archetype. This is something that is greater than any individual. The question is it independent of us? And when we turn around and say it's an hallucination, what do we mean by hallucination? Oliver Sacks, the great British American psychiatrist, in his last book, Hallucinations, argued about this. And we don't know what hallucinations are. All we know is hallucinations are something that is not shared by somebody else. That's all. It doesn't mean they're no more real, because in my books I go into the quantum physics of how external reality is no more real than internal reality. And in fact, we are continually collapsing the wave function of the reality we live around, that has been around us. This is from pure quantum physics, but that's for another talk. So I started to researching this a little bit more, and I came across some extraordinary things. In 2018, there was a cave discovered in northern India, in Chandili. It had not been opened for 8,000 years. And when they broke in, these were the paintings on the walls. Now look at these entities, large heads and black eyes. So clearly, 8,000 years ago in India, people were describing on the walls exactly the entities that I describe. Now, it is of great importance that they were done in caves. And if I get onto that later on, I'll explain why I think it's caves that these things are painted on. It's to do with melatonin release in the brain. So we then move on to these. The one on the left-hand side is in the Junction Shelter, which is in the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. Now, Graham Hancock, the writer, spent some time there, and it was Graham Hancock that first noticed this creature here, this being here with the shape of its face. Now, clearly these individuals are moving towards it, or they're reacting towards it. Now, this is another painting from Pechmerle in the south of France. It's called The Dying Man. Again, we have exactly the same shaped face, exactly the same. Now, people have argued and said, well, these are idealized human figures, because our ancient ancestors were not very good at painting. Really, look at the depictions of bison in Lascaux. They knew exactly what they were painting. They were painting from life. So when they painted this, they were being quite precise as to what they were painting. This was something they had seen. So we'll move on from here. Ain Ghazil in Jordan, 7,000 BCE. These entities, nobody's fully understood what these beings are. And again, at that time, they were able to depict human beings quite effectively. These are not human. Whatever they are not human. And then we have, within the traditions of the world's oldest culture, the indigenous population of Australia, they have these ideas of the Irantania and the Orentia, which are creatures from dream time. And in the paintings of these creatures, and here is one of them, we have yet again the same physiology, the same large eyes. So what is linking it here? An elderly woman on the Wirral on Merseyside, people in northern India, people in South Africa, and people in Australia, all depicting exactly the same entities that have been reported for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe more, in UFO encounters, in abduction cases and everything else as well. But clearly, whatever is happening here, it is deeper and much more ingrained in the human psyche than simply UFOs and aliens. These things go back centuries. They have been with us for centuries. So the question I ask in my book, The Hidden Universe, is what exactly are they? Now, if you go back into biblical writings, you will probably know that the ancient writings of the Hebrew people, not all of the books became canon. Not all of the books became part of the Bible, both the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. There were certain books that were considered to be so weird that they weren't included. Not because there was anything particularly wrong with them, but they were so odd that they couldn't include them. And one of them was the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is the only groups of people that have them in their canon ideas. The Ethiopian Copts and the people from Eritrea. And they have a language called Gazan, I think it's Gazal. And the original Book of Enoch is written in that language. Now, when you read the Book of Enoch, you realize why it's not in our regular Bible. because it is so bizarre. It tells of creatures that came down on Mount Hermon in the borders of the modern Lebanon into Israel. And these entities came down from the heavens and they procreated with human women. They taught human beings how to do many things, lots of medicine and everything else as well. So whatever these entities were, they were not human, but there was something special about them. Now, the Book of Enoch was such a peculiar book that in the it would have been probably the late 16th century, it became of great interest to an English magician called Dr. John Dee and his assistant Edward Kelly. And again, I discuss this in great detail in the book as to what Dee and Kelly were trying to do in their experiments in Mortlake in the late Elizabethan period. And what they were trying to do was raise entities. They were trying to create thought forms, which they called egregors. Now again, egregors comes from the Book of Enoch. Egregor comes from the Greek egregorus, which means watcher. It's the idea that we have been watched by entities that are non-human since the beginning of time. And these entities can come through into this reality using certain techniques. Now, I argue that this is exactly what Dee and Kelly were trying to do. And they argued in their books, they said they created entities and they created an Enochian language that they believed was the language of magic, that you could create these entities. Again, it's a fascinating read if you read exactly what Dee and Kelly were up to. It was very intriguing. So Dee and Kelly were doing this, but they didn't end there, because right up until the early 20th century, there were people trying to create these entities. And of course, the most famous one was Aleister Crowley. And of course, you guys will know that Crowley bought Boleskine Manor on the edges of Loch Ness in the early 20th century. And he bought this place in because it was isolated. And he could do some Abrahamic and some Enochian magic there to bring forth entities from somewhere else. And he created entities. He argued he created these entities. And one of them was called Lamb. And this is Lamb here. And again, if you look at Lamb, with the exception of the eyes, we have exactly the same physiognomy. We have exactly the same entity. Now, again, you can see on the right hand side of the picture, you can also see the Whitley Strieber image from what Whitley Strieber encountered, the entities Whitley Strieber encountered, I think in the early 1980s in upstate New York. Now, these creatures are again identical. So what do we have here? We have a theme. We have an archetype that goes back in the past. Now, but this goes back even to different traditions. One of the most amazing writers, and I quote him a lot in my work, is Henri Corbin, who was a French Sufi writer. And the Sufis are the mystic tradition of Islam. And they believe that there are two worlds. There's the world of the imaginal, which is mind created, but is independent of us, if that makes sense. It is something that we can create by our thought forms, and we can draw these into our world, and we create them by our anticipations of them. And indeed, this is one of the things within Islamic tradition, is something called the djinn. Now, in the Quran, it says that when God created man, he made man out of clay, he made the angels out of light, and he made the jinn out of smokeless fire. Now, this is important, what he meant, the writers of the Quran meant by smokeless fire. What exactly is smokeless fire, and why are these entities described in such a way? I'll return to that later, because I think I know what smokeless fire is. We then have the writings of the amazing Walter Evans Wentz, who in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, I think it was in the early 1920, he did a survey of the fairy faith. Again, we were talking earlier about me being Scouse or from Liverpool. I can only say furry. I can never say fairy. It's always furry. So I'm Not going to change that now. And the fairy faith in Celtic countries is the whole idea of the Celtic fringe. So you'll get Ireland and Wales and the western coast of Scotland, where it seems that the barrier between this world and the other world is thinner for some reason. And again, I'm talking with anthropologists about this at the moment as to why this may be and what are the antecedents of the Celtic people that make this so open. Now, as a personal admission, I'm possibly fairly unusual in the sense I'm literally a full-blooded Celt. I am Welsh, Irish, Scottish by origin, and I've recently had my DNA done, and I'm literally, in the Isle of Man. I have no other taints. I am a total Celt. And I'm also not precognitive, and I don't see fairies or anything. So whatever genetically has not come out in me, but it's one of these things. It means probably why my interests are in it. But Evans Vents, some of the things he found and discovered there was extraordinary. And again, I write about some of the things he described in his books. Now, Evans Vents is a fascinating man because he had earlier translated the Tibetan Book of the Dead for the Western world. Because the Tibetan Book of the Dead is also something that is really quite fascinating, which we'll come back to. But I'm intrigued by, again, the linkage between the fairy folk and the entities, the fae, and underground, the Cuthlonic creatures. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, for instance, they were entities that used to rule the world, but then went underground. They left us and went underground. The same tradition is in Scotland. You know, you have the writings of the writer whose name escapes me at the moment, who wrote a book called The Secret Commonwealth in Western Scotland in the late 17th century. And again, and he was a Church of Scotland vicar, as far as I can remember. So very, very intriguing stuff. So who are these creatures and why are they linked to darkness and underground? Oh, here is the Robert Kirk, who wrote the book The Secret Commonwealth. And interestingly enough, Robert Kirk was found dead on a furry mound at the end of his life, which is very, very curious. And his work is fascinating. Again, get the opportunity to read this. Read it with an open mind. Read it with a mind as an anthropologist, looking at the belief systems of an older society, without doing the argument that it's a primitive society. Don't make assumptions that these people were primitive. They were reacting to the things they saw in their environment around them. These were very real. And the question is, why were they so real to them and not so real to us? And this is where I go with the book. Then we move on to modern day abductions and UFO abductions. I find it intriguing that, again, these entities look like owls. And it seems to be that sometimes, particularly with young children, they tend to cloak themselves in kind of quasi-dream sequences, whereby they look like owls. The other tropes that you tend to find in abduction sequences with young children is that the entities describe themselves as being rabbits. The rabbit tropes happen all the time. And again, of course, the greatest rabbit trope and going underground is somebody I've written about extensively, and I'm working with a couple of research friends of mine on a book on him, is Lewis Carroll, Reverend Dodgson. Because, of course, at the start of Alice in Wonderland, what happens? She sees a rabbit and she gets taken underground by the rabbit and falls down a hole in the ground. Now, one of the people I write about consistently is an American temporal lobe epileptic artist called Myron Dial. And Dial consistently has hallucinations where he sees rabbits and he sees entities that take him somewhere else. And again, in the book, I discuss in great detail about the experiences of Myron Dial. So again, we have this similar trope. Now, remember, these are going back years. The children here would not know about the Junction shelter in South Africa. Why would they? These are the things they're reporting as seeing. So what is going on here? Have we got some kind of information as to what might be happening? Now, I believe these entities are created by us and become independent of us. And I'll give an example of just how powerful the human mind can be. In the early 1970s, there were a group of researchers in Canada, in Toronto. And they were paranormal researchers, but they were playing with paranormal research rather like the SPR and like you guys do, whereby they wanted to understand it. So they started playing around with Ouija boards and everything else as well. And they were intrigued, as most of us are when we first use Ouija, is how does the glass move? Is it an intention of the people around the table? Are we doing it subliminally, but we don't know we're doing it? And what they did was they thought, well, maybe that is the case. So how can we prove it? So what they decided to do was to create a ghost. And they went away, and one of them was a creative writer. And she wrote a backstory of a guy called Philip Aylesford. And they said that Philip Aylesford was an Englishman living in the 1670s, 1680s, after the English Civil War, in the English Midlands, in Warwickshire. And they based his life on a known castle in Warwickshire. They made him an outsider. They made him a Catholic nobleman who was in a loveless marriage. And one day he's out walking the grounds and he meets a gypsy girl and he falls in love with her. His wife subsequently finds out and he kills himself by throwing himself off the battlements of the castle. So that was the backstory. Then the group get together and they try to create him. They talk about him all the time and they laugh and joke. Now, what is intriguing here is what they were creating is what I would call an egregor. Now, an egregor is, as we said, with egregorus, which means watcher, but I use the term egregor in its more general term. An egregor is any kind of something that's created collectively by people. So, for instance, socialism is an egregor. The Coca-Cola logo is an egregor. These are all things that are created by human beings that seem to become bigger than us. Okay, and there's a guy called Mark Stavish, who's an American occult writer, and he's written this most extraordinary book on egregores. And again, if you want to read the background to some of my ideas, check out the Stavish work. It's very, very good. And again, if anybody's interested in my own podcast, I've interviewed Mark Stavish, and a lot of the people I talk about in my lectures, I've interviewed in my own podcasts for background material here. So they then start creating this character, and they discovered, and this is quite intriguing, they found that they would get manifestations. They would get raps and they would get knocks when they brought Philip through. And they would get messages from him. You know, like the old rap, 1 rap for no, 2 raps for yes or whatever. They were getting messages. But what was extraordinary, they found that they could only create Philip effectively when they acted like children. They cracked jokes and they were silly and flippant. Now, I'd argue this is because it's the ego state. When you get into a child ego state, and the group of you in a child ego state, it's going back to the old transactional analysis idea of ego states, child, adult, and parent. And if you get to the child state, your mind goes into a slightly different worldview. And I think this again can reproduce in people being a child again. And of course, we know with children, they have, as we said with the Halliwell book, they seem to be able to create entities. They seem to collectively cause themselves to go into Charles Bonnet syndrome. The interesting thing was that over a period of time, they had phenomenal effects. You know, they had the rapping, they had the messages, but they had table levitation. The table would levitate. Now, this is extraordinary because in 1973, I think it was, they appeared on national television in Canada. And it was a live television show, and the table levitated inside the theatre, inside the TV studio. So clearly they were creating something incredibly powerful. And I argue this is an egregor. We create these egregores by anticipating them. Again, I'm working with a couple of researchers at the moment where we're planning to reproduce the Philip experiment. We've spoken to a lot of top researchers around the world, Stephen Browday, people like that are all getting involved in helping us to try and recreate this. So it's going to be an interesting exercise that we're planning to do in the future. But we then move on, and you guys will know well about this, about the skull experiment, you know, in Norfolk. Now, the skull experiment is quite interesting, and it has parallels. Again, you guys that are probably heavily into spiritualism and the history of spiritualism will know about the case of something and Rector. It was Stainton Moses who did a series of experiments, I think in the 1890s, where they were being communicated by entities from somewhere else. Now, in the 1890s, they of course considered them to be the dead. because that's what they would do. You know, it's the idea the dead are trying to communicate with us. Imperator and Rector was the case in question. And again, what was interesting was that the Skull experiment very much paralleled this. And they were getting messages through in Skull where there were a group of people from, quote, the other side, who were trying to facilitate communication with us, this side. And of course, you had exactly the same phenomenon that they recreated with the Philip experiment. You had tables moving, you had lights moving round, you had imagery coming through. Now, the imagery that particularly interested me was this, which was called Blue, which is this entity here that supposedly came through, I think, on one of the cameras. Look at it. That's not a ghost. That's a grey, isn't it? It's not a ghost. So we were interpreting, and they were interpreting it as being a group of people trying to communicate with them. It's far more sinister than that. It's a group of entities that have been created by our expectations that we are giving independence to, that then want to accommodate us to be what we want them to be. This is why these entities culturally track. This is why the UFO phenomenon, you know, in the 1890s, you had the airships. People were seeing airships in the air. And when the people who were the supposed crew of the airship came down and communicated with people, they usually spoke, they were human beings, they were normal human beings who normally spoke with a German accent because they were foreign. But they were literally manipulating the reality to present themselves as the way we want them to be. They then morphed, and after the Second World War, we got into the classic, after the Arnold sightings in 1947, we got into classical UFOs, and they started looking like Nordics. Remember, they were tall, blonde creatures. Then we went through a phase of monsters. And then we got to the greys. It's cultural tracking. It's responding to our anticipations of what they're going to be like. This is why the communications and the spirit communications in the 19th century were very much like what they expected it to be. And it's because of this that skeptics have turned around and said, well, the phenomenon is nonsense. Let's be a bit more sophisticated about this. This phenomenon is not nonsense. This phenomenon is playing with us. Now, again, some of you may have come across the writings of a guy called Fisher. And he wrote a book called The Hungry Ghosts. Again, I think it was probably in the early 1990s. And again, he was fooled by entities that he thought were people that he'd lived with in a past life. And these entities would come through in circumstances and seances and talk to him. But he decided to check them out. And one of the entities claimed it was from Greece in the 18th century. And it named the village it came from and the part of Greece it came from. It was on the Turkish border in Thessaloniki, or near Thessaloniki. And he went over there to find that the village didn't exist, and he'd been conned. And he ended up committing suicide, or supposedly committed suicide, because he was so depressed by finding that whatever the entities were, they were playing with him. They were playing with his anticipations, or they wanted to come across to him in certain ways. This is what these things do. They play with us. Now, this comes back to the concept of tulpas. Now, Alexandra David Neal was a Belgian lady who had married somebody quite wealthy and spent most of her time traveling the world. And she spent a great deal of time in Tibet in the 1920s. And there she learnt the techniques, the Tibetan techniques of creating thought forms, tulpas. And she describes in one of her books, they created a tulpa. Her and her little group of friends created a tulpa while they were in Tibet. They created a little monk who was a smiley, round, friendly monk. And it started following them. And it was following their party. But then it started to become independent of them and became malevolent. And suddenly it changed from being a round, rotund, little, friendly little creature to this more monstrous being that was actually being nasty towards them. So they had to literally decreate it. They had to unthink it out of existence. Because as Alexandra Neal said, this being may not have existed initially, But as soon as we started to think about it and created it, it then became something. It drew itself in from somewhere else by using us to allow it to manifest within this reality. Now, Graham Murray is somebody who I came in contact with around about 8 or 9 years ago. Graham was one of the top theatre producers in this country, and he was the guy that set up the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. And Graham and I met because Graham had read one of my books and he thought it was really interesting and wonderful. And we were working on getting together to develop a new play by J.B. Priestley. We have discovered a brand new play by J.B. Priestley, by the way, that nobody knows about. Literally, Graham and I knew about it, and Priestley's son, and that's it. I've now put the book out to a few more people. Priestley's great-grandson has now read it and things, but it's an intriguing new time play that Graham and I were going to try and get on. But sadly, Graham died 3 years ago of a sudden heart attack, which is very, very sad. But suffice to say, Graham, in his biography, What Can Go Wrong Will Go Wrong, I think it was called, something like that. He described, and he told me this story. So I heard this story from him directly, although it's in his book. He one day had to meet up with a very famous, basically occult magician called Hernigstad, who was a Danish aristocrat. And they spent an evening together, and they got discussing about the concept of egregores and the egregore and the beast in the Beauty and the Beast. And Hernigstad turned around to Graham and said, of course, Nazism, these are all egregores, but the beast is inside all of them. And he said, I'll prove it to you. And Graham told me, and it made shivers go down my spine. He said, we were sitting there and there was a chair opposite us. And he said, suddenly this entity appeared in the chair. And he said it was monstrous. It was like your idea of a demon. And he said it looked directly at me and scowled and then evaporated away. And Hernigstad had created this thought form, had put it into his mind. But as Graham said to me, it was extraordinary because it was really there. And as I pointed out to Graham, there were two hallucinations going on here. There was hallucination of the creature he saw, but there was also the hallucination of exclusion, because it meant that the back of the chair that was occluded by the entity was also taken out of his vision field. Now, this is something that various writers have discussed in the past about hallucinations, how they seem to manipulate the reality outside of us in some way. They're in our visual field, but they're outside of us in some way. Okay, so that really intrigued me as to what was going on here. And then I was approached by an American researcher called Paul Eno. Paul Eno is an ex-Catholic priest who, because he was running around New England doing ghost hunts and things, he decided he didn't want to be a priest anymore and wanted to be a researcher. Now, the thing is with Eno has some fascinating... By the way, Paul Eno is, if anybody recognises the name Eno, he's the cousin of Brian Eno, who used to be the guy in Roxy Music. So if you're interested in terms of that, he's very much from old English aristocracy. His family originally came from Devon, a place called Sandford Courtenay. But suffice to say, Paul has been doing a lot of research into entities, and he's fascinated by entities. And again, if anybody's interested, I've interviewed him a couple of times on my podcast. He believes, now get this, he believes that these entities are created out of plasma. They use our anticipations to create plasma fields. And the plasma fields they can become in focus within this reality. And he gives examples in his books of how you can see these entities kind of coming into form. They're coming into form. Now, plasma, I'm doing research at the moment with one of America's top astrophysicists, a guy called Professor Bob Davis. And Bob Davis and I both agree about plasma. And when I spoke to Bob Davis a couple of weeks ago, he said, no, you're quite right. He said, plasma is such a curious substance because plasma is another form of matter that is so unusual. And he argues the same thing. He said, what these entities are doing are creating plasma, and they're using plasma. This is why you get electromagnetic fields around them. This is why they are able to manipulate our thought patterns because they're playing around with our brain using electromagnetic energy to actually make the neurons fire in different ways and open up the doors of perception in certain ways. So his stuff is really, really intriguing as to the true nature of what reality really is. Now, that's a very, very quick run through of the myriad of things I discuss in my 11th book, which is the Hidden Universe. But this is part of a much broader model I have. And if any of you have read my work, you'll know that my model is much broader than this. And on each book, I focus in on one particular area. But at the moment, my fascination is, what is this reality? Is it a simulation? Is it a computer simulation? Is it a mind-created collective hallucination that we all share? And in my forthcoming book, I'll be doing the science of this. I've been talking with some of the world's leading quantum physicists, and particularly individuals who are doing research into virtual reality and how virtual reality works within the brain and how we facsimilize virtual reality. This guy I'm working with at the moment, who is a Cambridge educated doctor in neurology, who's over in Japan, called Dr. Andrew Gallimore. And Gallimore calls this reality an instantation rather than a simulation. And again, we do the science of this. We can do, and I do the science of how this simulation works. So I'm not just somebody that's turning around and saying, oh, I think it's a simulation because it looks like one. I do the science. I do the science down to black holes, how black holes, it's to do with information. It's to do with the way in which black holes work. It's to do with the last work of Stephen Hawking. It's to do with Hawking radiation. And it's to do with something called the holographic principle. We know that from quantum physics that this world is collapsed. The wave function of this perceptual world is collapsed from a statistical wave that has no physical presence at all. It is literally a statistical wave. So everything that we perceive is collapsed in that way. And modern quantum physics has known this since at least 1924, 25, with when they sorted out and did the Schrödinger calculation and the Schrödinger wave function. And of course, then Max Born came along later on and said that the wave function, in fact, is simply a statistical wave function like a crime wave. So we're talking about non-physical things here. Now, it's interesting to note here, and I'm delighted to see that Nick Kyle is in the audience because, of course, Nick was one of the guys who witnessed a lot of the phenomenon that took place in Skull. And I know that Nick has shared information with me about the things he saw there. So these things are very physical. They impinge themselves upon our sensual apparatus. But effectively, what are they and what is really happening here? And this is the center of my research at the moment. And we've got some great people involved in my work. And if any of you guys are interested in getting involved or knowing about it, please just stay in contact. Right, I think I'm probably finished now in terms of time. Did I do okay on time there, Scott?
Yep, perfect.
Right, so if I can now come out of here, which I will try and do if I can. No, I've just hidden myself.
I'll stop your screen.
Right.
I'll save you the burden.
I'll stop sharing. See, okay, that's good.
There you go.
Right.
Lance, you're muted.
Unmute me. Perhaps I muted myself. Okay, yes, no wonder. Listen, there are a couple of people who've got questions in the chat, and they include people whom I know you know, Anthony. So I think I might ask Scott if he wouldn't mind unmuting a few of them, and we perhaps get a little discussion going here. Peter Bruin and Paul Hennigan and Gavin Ritchie and Bob Steck. And Nick Kyle as well, of course. Perhaps you just unmute all of those, and I'll give each of them a turn. But we can perhaps, if everybody's a little bit patient, we can actually get a sort of quadripartite or cinquipartite exchange going here. We could start with Peter Bruin, if he doesn't mind.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped in early, Tony, to ask if tulpas were the same as egregores, and then you said that they were, so that took care of my first.
that was precognition there, Peter. It was a short-term deja vu.
Are there any sort of is it just a cultural definition depending geography and so on that causes people to call tulpas and egregores?
Yeah, exactly. It's linguistic. You know, The word tulpa actually comes from Tibetan. and egregor, as I said, originally came from ancient Greek. But different cultures call them different things, but they are universal. These entities are universal.
Yeah. Another observation rather than a question was that Crowley chose Boleskine because the demands of the Abramelin rite were very specific, and Boleskine was a location and a house that happened to fit those requirements, and that's why he went there.
So it's Boleskine, obviously Boleskin, obviously.
Boleskin, like Mulder. Could we go on to more general topics? These linguistic ones are interesting, but very specialist. Peter, I know you're interested in UFOs, and,
yes.
and you've made the point before that UFOs vary from period to period, which is interesting, since one of the things that Anthony seemed to be saying when he was showing us very early cave paintings was that some of the inhabitants or passengers on UFOs seem to be the same, or these egregores seem to be rather similar.
It's actually more to do with the style of the UFOs themselves, because in the 50s they looked like UFOs in the movies in the 50s, and then as we go through different decades, they kind of change shape. And I think triangle UFOs and delta-shaped UFOs are the current fashion. So I'm not quite sure where that came from, but it seems very much to fit in with Anthony's thesis about the cultural tracking he talked about, which I think is a fascinating concept.
Well,
and
of course,
born out by experience.
It's the idea as well, isn't it? You know, the Adamski craft from the early 1950s, which is, I'm maybe corrected wrong, but I think they discovered was the top of a vacuum cleaner. So clearly, you know, people try to reproduce these things, but it is greater than just. I mean, for instance, I've long argued that the impishness of the UFO phenomenon is such to lead you to believe that there's some kind of joke going on somewhere. You know, there was the classic case, wasn't there, of the guy in the southern states of America who went off on a UFO and was given pancakes by the aliens, and they had his dog outside the UFO and it fried its skin off, its hair off or something. There's jokes going on. There's games being played. You know, and I think there's a direct link here between UFO entities and DMT entities, because DMT entities seem to be playing the same game.
We've had David Luke on this series, and he's been very big on that. Sorry, do you want to say a last thing then, Peter?
Yeah, just that I know a couple of people whom I trust implicitly and absolutely who have been abducted, and I don't. That was their experience. It was very physical. It was very real. It wasn't imaginary, and it was repeated. So I think that the phenomenon has to be taken very seriously.
I think they do. I mean, one of the things that David, Luke, and I have worked together on a few projects in the past, and we'll be working together on a future project, which we're still talking about now. And David and I are both in a total agreement about this. You know, that there is a game being played, and I quote David in the new book quite extensively in terms of his encounters with DMT entities.
Good, thank you. Maybe Paul Hennigan, you wanted to say something about poltergeists. So did Gavin. Paul, what did you want to say there?
Several years ago, I did a course with some Zen Buddhist monks, like mindfulness, and hungry ghosts was referred to rather disparagingly, like every the man in the street, unaware of his enlightenment, as it were. So I'm wondering, is it something to do with what's been talked about as a kind of part of being human, that we just endlessly sort of minds are active. There's a kind of power in that.
Oh yeah, totally. That's exactly what I believe, is that the power of our own mind is much greater than we can even begin to understand. And Tricia is part of the group here, and Tricia and I were discussing this recently on a podcast about the way in which, you know, there seems to be a direct relationship between poltergeist activity and adolescence and things. I think we just underestimate the power of the mind, and if quantum physics can be believed, it is because there's a direct relationship between the act of observation and external reality. So it's a matter of whether we are limited by our own anticipations of what we can and cannot do. And there may be a part of us, a subliminal part of us, that can create these things around us because they're frustrated or they're annoyed or irritated or whatever. But it is very intriguing, yeah.
Gavin Richard was the one who wanted to ask a question about hungry poltergeists. I think he's gone a bit dark on us, but can we see you, Dimai?
I think my camera is on. I'm in via the Eventbrite interface, so
Maybe
I
it's
don't know whether that's blocking me out.
event not so bright. What did you want to say about poltergeists then, Gavin?
Well, it was actually when Andy mentioned about the malevolence and the game playing, and that sense of mischief also seems to come through from certain poltergeist investigators who suggest that the more they try, the more there seems to be an entity responding to them. And there's that aspect to it that suggests, could this be an entirely self-created thing, or is it a doorway that's created that then an external entity walks through? So it's not an entirely self-created. We create the door, we create the frame, and then something steps into it, and then it gains independence, but there actually is someone that was always independent that's pulling the strings.
Could I ask Bob Steck to comment on that? Because I see he's nodding his head rather vigorously.
It seems to me that I have a little bit of evidence, against that, and yet I'm intrigued by some of the discussion going on. In particular, in my work with Gary Schwartz, we worked with two mediums who both had a council of light or a council of 12 that worked with them from the other side. And both mediums inquired of their independent councils, could the councils communicate with one another? Did they have independent existence? And of course, both of them said, yes, we do. So we designed an experiment in which a randomly chosen picture was shown to one medium at a certain predetermined time, who showed it to her council. Supposedly her council then could show it to the other council, who could communicate what that picture was to the second medium, who would then pick out one of four pictures, one of which was the picture that was shown and the other three were not. And it seemed like this would be fantastic, proof of something going on the other side. It failed, to show any significance whatsoever, unfortunately. Similarly,
we can't quite hear you, Bob. You're very quiet.
Okay, several years ago, I also followed up on some people in the DMT forum who said, well, let's try and meet in this other space and let us use DMT to get to the same place so we can then compare notes. And they also failed. So trying to make sense of this in what's been talked about has been fascinating. I would love to keep up to date with what you're doing with conjuring up whomever it may be this time.
Okay, do you have a comment on this, Anthony?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I'm aware of Gary Schwartz's work. In fact, one of the three of us that are actually trying to reproduce the Philip experiment works very closely with Gary and has done over a number of years. I'm a great admirer of his work, and I think that is fascinating, your point about, and I think that was a wonderful protocol to try and do it that way. That was a brilliant piece of thinking, wasn't it, as to how to do that in such a way. And I find in my own research that sometimes you can't get the data that you need to say that this is external to us or internal to us. But I do know of individuals that claim, we've got no reason to disbelieve them, that in out-of-body states and in DMT states, they actually meet up with people. So what we need to do is to try and find a really perfect protocol to try and prove that this may be the case. Now, I know that Gary's work was very similar in many ways, wasn't it, to the Skull experiment and to Imperator and Rector, in the sense there was a group of people trying to communicate through. And I don't know, it just sometimes I feel we're being played with, but I'm not sure. And this is why it's so fascinating. This is why it's so ephemeral and chimerial in the way it changes and the way the phenomenon changes.
It is true, isn't it, that in shared near-death experiences, sometimes called shared death experiences, where the dying person has perhaps an end-of-life vision or actually goes into an NDE, and some of the people in the room perceive what's happening, perceive the entity that's there, or actually start going up into the light with the dying person. Other people in the same room don't see anything, don't experience anything. So the search for what you might call properly rational, in scientific terms, replicable evidence may always be rather doomed by the fact that whether it's a game or not, there's something selective about entities on the other side.
Yeah, it seems to be that they don't want to be discovered, and they play with us to actually ridicule people when they try to do proper experiments.
Mm.
Now, I think if we apply again the idea of we are creating our own reality around us, in a very crude sense. I mean, I do the physics of this, but in a very crude sense, then our collective anticipations are what we see. For instance, I've long, as a sociologist, and a sociologist of religion specifically, I've always been intrigued as to why certain people of certain religious groups genuinely believe their belief systems, and it could be the collective group reinforces it and actually creates the environment to reinforce those beliefs. For instance, the Marian visions that you have, these kind of things. It's self-evident, something happened in Fatima in 1917, 15 or 17, wherever it was, when the sun spun in the sky. Thousands of people saw that, but people, I've just been reading up recently about this, there were believers who did not see it, and there were skeptics who did see it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what's going on there? Because you'd expect the believers to see it and the skeptics to not.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's you wonder whether the phenomenon ever wants to be found, or whether it's just, I don't know.
How does anybody feel about an idea, which I think I quite well understood some of Bernardo Kastrup's views on this matter, and he's very Jungian, and he's into the collective unconscious thus, and archetypes and so on. And he tries to follow Jung in saying that the sort of entities, the sort of people that some people sometimes meet or see or intuit or whatever, are just different sorts of thing from ordinary sorts of things that we know in the materialist world. And they are psychic entities. Now, you don't even have to be a Jungian to know that there are psychic entities inhabiting our unconscious minds, which erupt into consciousness, and people do extraordinary things because they're driven by psychic entities. If you could give those psychic entities a certain extra validity so that they are, as it were, as real as material entities, since both material entities and psychic entities might both be examples of an expression of energy, so they might still be the same, but they might not appear on the same screens, as it were. They might not be visible in the same way. I mean, I wouldn't mind trying to see these things not just as sort of mental entities, but psychic entities, which are perhaps have more reality than just thoughts.
Well, we could apply, for instance, the ideas of C.D. Broad and people like Henri Bergson, and of course Aldous Huxley himself. And the idea that the brain acts as an attenuator in the sense it takes information out. Now, a group of people I know recently did some research at the University of Sussex, and they I think it was people on magic mushrooms. And they then did MRI scans on the brains of these individuals, expecting the magic mushrooms to make the brain more communicative and to make the brain more effective, because effectively they were doing something that people ordinarily didn't do in neurotypical workings. But it did the opposite. It switched parts of the brain off. In other words, it was stopping the brain doing what it's supposed to do, which is act as an attenuator. And if that is the case, this means that that we just aren't designed within whatever this simulation is. We are not designed for our senses to attune to the broader reality. Now, I came up with a term a few years ago. I call it electromagnetic chauvinism. And the idea that, we assume that what we see, there's a one-to-one relationship with what we see to what is external reality. Now, we know that's not the case. We know that's not the case. We have people like the famous essay, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. The idea is, we all live in our perceptual universes, and we believe that is absolutely it. But of course it isn't, because, you read the writings of people like Richard L. Gregory, for example, Professor Gregory, in terms of visual systems. It's an inward creation. The brain takes the information from very garbled bits of information from the back of the retina and creates this three-dimensional reality around us. And I used the argument once, and I said, we think that everything we see is what is out there. And I said, imagine the electromagnetic spectrum from gamma rays to radio waves is the Mississippi River. And it starts in a small lake in Minnesota, comes right down the center of the states, and then comes out at the Gulf of Mexico. Our visual system, and everything we think is visual and therefore real and validated, is one inch about 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. The rest of it we can't see, we can't perceive, and we don't perceive. But we have the analysis in astronomy. We have radio astronomy. And people never think, well, radio astronomy is just as effective at mapping the universe as normal light astronomy. But clearly there's much more that we can't perceive.
Yes, that's clearly a very good point and a very scientific one. Can we go back to Gavin Ritchie, whom we can now see? He's got a couple of points here, one of them more alarming than the other. Gavin, would you like to make your points? Your first one first.
Yeah, I suppose, I find the model that you're proposing really very attractive, because I like the idea of grabbing a lot of these phenomena and trying to fit them into a framework, all of them into a cohesive framework. But one of the questions is, if this is possible, then why is reality so stable in general? And what are the conditions that seem to cause these kinds of phenomena to happen? Is belief, for instance, enough to bring these things on? And then philosophically, do we have something to thank the prevailing model of materialism for, that we're not having to deal with abductions into fairy knolls or UFOs en masse? This is just something that happens very rarely. I just wonder if you had any thoughts on what causes reality to become soft in these places.
Yes, it's intriguing, isn't it? The way in which reality seems to be consistent in its own way. It doesn't change. Effectively, I go to bed at night, and when I wake up the next morning, everything is in the same location in the bedroom. And of course, this is the typical argument that reality is as it seems because it's consistent. But there is a counter argument to say that within a dream sequence, there is a consistency within dreams. That the environment you're within tends to be fairly solid, and you move around within this three-dimensional reality. And yet it is completely supposedly mind created. Yet it seems to have independence of you. For argument's sake, for instance, one of my associates, Robert Wagner, who is an expert on lucid dreaming, argues that when you dream, who is the bricoleur, who is the person creating the dream scenario? Because it sure as hell isn't you, because you're an observer of it, just in the same way you're an observer of external reality. Now, you could take an extremely solipsistic viewpoint here and say that the only thing you know, and I'm not saying Bishop Berkeley was right, but you have to argue that the only thing you know with absolute surety is that you are something perceiving something. The mystery in philosophy, the mystery of other minds, the quandary of other minds, are other minds sentient? Are they a projection of you or not? Now, obviously, that route lies in sanity. But effectively, are we collectively, by our acts of collective observation as a species, creating the stability? In other words, you at the moment, because you're viewing me on a screen, you're seeing what's behind my head and the door and the pictures. But within my world, I don't need to render those because they're unnecessary within my simulation. But the question has to be, and as Gavin quite rightly says, does it mean that because we live in a materialist, reductionist worldview, that this is why our reality has the solidity it has? Now, of course, you could apply the old ideas of Cohn's theory of revolutions, the idea that we live within a particular worldview, And it then changes, from the Aristotelian, everything seemed to work in the Aristotelian world, then it went Newtonian, then it became quantum. And we all collectively agree with that worldview. And I wonder, for instance, and this is a very intriguing point, is that 95% of humanity are still stuck in the science of 125, 130 years ago, prior to Max Planck and his December 1900 announcement about quantum energy. And subsequently then Einstein mentioned Earth 5 in his great year and his 3 papers. But most people aren't aware of that. They still see the certainties of the Newtonian world. And yet we know in 1981, Alain Aspect, Dalibard and Roger did an experiment in Paris which proved that particles can communicate instantaneously at any distance. People don't know that, but I would just wonder if more people start to know these things, the collective unconsciousness starts to change, and our egregor, our collective egregor, will change, and reality will cease to be quite as solid as it seems, because we're all collapsing the same wave function. But if we're collapsing different wave functions, it starts to dissolve slightly, if that makes any sense. And that's just me thinking.
That's what I wonder.
Yes. But do we have any more questions? There's a sort of discussion about the performance of a particular intergalactic crocodile, which I think we'll pass over in the in the chat. I mean, of course, the question has come up from Nick Kyle. I don't know whether he'd like to say anything here about emotion in all this.
The school experiments, I only took part in 2 sittings, but a sense of bonding between the group of hosts and their invited guests was always stressed as important, and music and singing and statements of dedication or prayers, if you like, were used to try and get people in some kind of brainwave cohesion. So I went home and practiced for 10 years in various groups, both spiritualist churches and at home, trying to replicate the effectiveness of the school procedures, including buying some of their crystals and so on. And basically nothing happened, nothing different from a normal spiritualist seance, until I sat with 2 physical mediums, and we had a great bond between us. I would almost describe it as love. And we giggled and laughed our way to full and partial materializations on about 8 occasions. And I've never forgotten the importance of emotion. Indeed, in a Glasgow tea room just 2 years ago, we met up, the 3 of us, the 2 mediums and myself, and we giggled at a joke that I made, and the table went up 2 feet in the air. And while we were laughing at that, another coffee table began to rise in the air where a customer was seated that was nothing to do with us. And in my work with mediums, and as well as my own frail mediumship, Spirit seemed to be very keen to let us know that an emotional bond is more productive than a simple desire. And I've often thought that we know so little about our minds, but even less about our emotions. I remember someone saying once that human progress had more to do with jokes than normal cognitive processing, because in the idea of a joke is you think you understand a situation, and in the punchline you get a word or a statement that completely changes your understanding of what you thought you understood. And I think that humor may contain psychological states and emotions, not feelings, which are slightly different, but emotions may reveal psychological states that allow us to make that quantum leap, maybe, into other dimensions. That would be my view. Emotions are going to be much more productive in the future than simply cognitive processing.
I find that with my group, when we get together, because we're all very close and we know each other really well and everything else as well. And we create this incredible something that is greater than we are, that is an element of all of us. And that is such a wonderful feeling. And I'm quite with you there on that, Nick, because this is one of the central points that the guys in the Philip experiment said, wasn't it? You know, that it was when they reached that collectiveness and they told jokes and they sang songs and they were silly, that's when it worked. That's when it happens. And I think this is a very important area of inquiry, isn't it? You know, to maybe pursue this a little bit more and to see where we can take this. Because I think as a group, you know, the very fact that we're all involved in discussing this is that we're interested in it, aren't we? We want to understand. We know from our own experiences that extraordinary things happen. And I don't doubt them for 1 minute. And it's quantifying and understanding and why it is that some people, extraordinary things happen all the time. And yet there are other people that go through their whole life and never see anything extraordinary. You know.
It wouldn't be the least surprising, would it, if things are different from what we expect? And by the way, Scott, there's a terrible noise going on from somebody's computer. Perhaps you could mute everybody except me. No. Oh, or perhaps it's coming from my computer. Let's hope not. But I was looking at Penny Whitbrod, who is an American lady who had a near-death experience, which you can find on YouTube the other day. And she had a very explicit life review in her NDE with a person she called God. She was a believing Catholic. I think perhaps we would more modestly say she met a very important being of light or something. Anyway, whoever it was that was taking her through her NDE, she was pretty good being a practicing Catholic about good things and bad things, and how she was all standing by to regret the bad things, and she was standing by to try and be pleased about the good things she's done and hoping to get approval from the being of light. Fair enough. It became apparent to her, however, that the being of light wasn't particularly interested in, forgiveness for the bad things she'd done, or even to pat her on the back for the good things. The being of light was very keen on more life, new experience, progress, going on with your journey, keeping on the way forward, not looking back too much. Now, that's perfectly comprehensible, but that's an area where we've been brought up for, certainly since Christianity was established, 2,000 years ago, we're brought up to feel that whatever it is, if anything that goes on beyond the grave, it must be some sort of judgment for the good and bad of our souls. But actually, well, I'm coming round to Christine Smith has put the cosmic joke into the chat here. Well, maybe, what we want is more fun. Go out and try extinguishing a cigarette on your big toe and see how you feel. That'll be, sort of something absurd like that. It would certainly change your view of things. And this might explain why some things seem so bad that aren't. Anyway, go on. Sorry, Anthony.
One of the things I would draw out there was, because we haven't discussed any of my previous work, and my previous work will probably be unknown to a number of you guys, but I know a number of you are aware of my previous work. But one of the concepts that features in virtually all my books is my daemonadal on dyad. And in that I argue, and I very much identify who the being of light is in the Panoramic Life Review. And the being of light is your own higher self. The being of light is in fact your daemon. You're the being that has lived your life many times before, your universal you. And the being of light is there to guide you at the end of your life, to say these are the things you got right in this part of the game. I argue that our lives are similar to a third-person computer game of your life. And every time you live your life, you can change it slightly or change it dramatically. And the game player that knows of all the games you've played is your daemon. Therefore, the daemon at the end of your life manifests itself, and it will manifest itself in whatever it needs to make you feel at ease. So again, extrapolating from what we were saying before, that the world accommodates us. I'd argue that the daemon does exactly that, just like the UFO phenomenon does. What it will do is, if you are a Christian, it will come as Jesus or God. If you are a Hindu, it will manifest as Shiva or Brahman or whatever. And It may manifest itself as being your grandmother who's passed over. It might manifest it whatever it needs to make you feel relaxed. Now, there's a friend of mine who's doing research in non-standard hauntings and non-standard ghosts and non-standard anticipations of entities. And she's doing research into things like young children who have near-death experiences that see Mickey Mouse. Young children who the being of light are friends that are still alive from school or their school teachers. So clearly, whatever this being is, it's not what it presents itself as being. And it can't. Because if it turned around and said, "Oh, I'm you, and I'm trying to guide you," you're not going to go, "Woo, I can't do that." But of course, what is all the basic teachings of the religion? Find the Buddha within, find the Christ within. This is the basic teachings. And of course, the argument is that in the final analysis, we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So, like Kastrup's argument, I differ in some areas with Kastrup, but, the idea is, I do more science than he does. And the idea is, that are we a collective unconscious? In which case, what is that collective unconscious? Is it DNA memory? Whatever it is, this is something that suggests that when you live your life a good life, purely and simply because when you injure other people, you're injuring yourself. You're not achieving anything in any shape or form. And that's what I believe is the reason I think that we live our lives over and over again as us, not as other people, but as us. Because my argument is that if I die, I don't want to be reborn as somebody else. I want to relive my life again with the people I love now, with my family, with my loved ones, with my parents, with my wife, people I love, to go on and move on to another life and not remember anything about your previous life and be dumped in a completely different life with no memories is a nightmare. You might as well just be a different person. Whereas if you're reborn as yourself with that memory of last time and the guidance that you can be given by the daemon, I think that feels quite liberating. It's the idea of I can put right the wrongs I've done in this life.
Yes, that's the notion of progress is preserved by that, which I do believe the higher powers wish. Could I, however, just say, ladies and gentlemen, we appear to be having an absolute proof of the truth of what Anthony's saying, because if you look at your screens, you'll see that there are 2 Peter Bruins. At least on my screens, if you scroll through, you'll see there are 2 Peter Bruins, presumably his daimon and his eidolon. They appear to be smiling in the same way, but one of them moves at a slightly different time from the other. So this is a paranormal moment I think you should treasure. So I think I'm just going to move on from that, and I would just like to pick up a little comment which might be well known to Anthony, but it might not be. Our friend Evelyn Elsa Essa has put in, who is a world expert on after-death communications.
Evelyn, it's lovely to see you here. Wonderful to see you. I've known Evelyn for so long.
Great.
It's really great that she's here.
Well, I'm getting to love her too, and she tells us that emotions, talking of love, come through very strongly in after-death communications. They come through, and of course they provoke emotion, I suppose, in the person receiving them. And that's a place where emotion does figure in our researches. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are sort of coming to the end here. I'm going to have to say goodnight twice to Peter and once to each of the rest of you. Tricia Robertson has added the undoubtedly good comment, no one said this was going to be easy. And maybe that's something we should end on. Is we have to admire people like Anthony and so many others, Gary Schwartz, many people on this call, and many of our Tuesday talkers, because it is extremely difficult. I mean, we all know that astrophysics is very complicated, and we know that quantum physics is complicated. But there are lots of people on this planet who, with their computers and their helpers and their machines and their great brains, have worked out some extraordinary things about the universe, which surely must be at least as complicated as any of this spiritual stuff. And they get results. And we are still at the stage, for all our optimism and this huge quantity of evidence, of not quite understanding or having the tools to understand our own results. I mean, do you want to just make a final comment about that, Anthony? I mean, you've worked on this for a long time, and I mean, how far do you think you've Scott?
Well, that's $1 billion question. Do I instinctively feel that I've got greater understanding now, but really, will we ever be able to understand the human condition in its entirety? We are inside a system, and you can never really fully understand a system if you are already inside it. You have to be outside of it to understand it. And I've always discussed with my little group and said, just imagine if we are right and this is a simulation and we've twigged it. What happens next? What happens if the sprites on your screen become sentient and aware that they're sprites? It's the argument, isn't it, within the movie The Matrix? The idea that we're all batteries, and as soon as we discover we're batteries, we have a revolution on our hands. But I will continue researching and reading around this subject because it just fascinates me. And
well, that's great. I mean, and I think I'd like to sign off with one of Nick Kyle's best, which you can perhaps see in the chat. If anyone tells you that nothing is impossible, know that I do nothing a lot of the time. Seems a sort of gnomic thing. Well, listen, that was absolutely fantastic and a great deal of food for thought. And if we could, and a lot of nice things being said in the chat, I'd like just to do one of the mostly silent hand claps to say thank you very much, Anthony. I hope we're going to see you again on this, and I hope you'll come back to Edinburgh, where, of course, we know you've been before. And everybody's saying thank you very much.
I've got so many friends up there. I always feel at home in Edinburgh.
Well, that's absolutely marvellous. Right.
Got to.
Yes. Okay. More jokes coming into the chat, but I think I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Thank you very much indeed. We'll be in touch. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everybody. It was lovely.
Bye. Thanks for your patience. Bye.
Not at all. Bye for now, everybody.